cut and pasted all over Telegram. Oh, we don't talk about him, do we? No, of course we don't. And listen, I'm not going to go on and on. I'm going to just pass the mic over. The man can do it himself. Mark Devlin.
Well, thanks very much. Hello folks, good to be back in Norwich. And this is a presentation which I've not put out there publicly before. It does consist of elements which I have spoken about before, but I've not weaved them all together in this way on any previous occasion. So hopefully it will make sense, but we'll see as we go, eh? And I'm starting on time. Nobody's more surprised than me, because there's usually some sort of technical issues, but we appear to have some techies in the house who know what they're doing tonight, which is definitely a novelty at my gigs. Nobody wants to look to me as a technical advisor, trust me. All right then, so let's launch into it. This presentation is titled, as you can see, Culture Creation. And it's all about social engineering by any other name. It's the realm of lifetime actors. We'll be meeting a fair few of those. And we're going to be looking at organisations which specialise in the shaping and moulding of thoughts and perceptions and even behaviours and actions on the part of the general public. So it's those who know how the human psyche works and how it can be manipulated. And unfortunately, in the vast majority of cases, it's not for the overall benefit and upliftment of all humanity. Why would it be? So it's through social engineers that we get things like political correctness, wokeism in the contemporary era, you know, biological females thinking they're biological males and vice versa, school children identifying as lawnmowers and wanting to be addressed as such. You know, 30 years ago, that would have been deemed mental illness and you would have ended up in an asylum for making such a claim. These days, you'll end up in an asylum for challenging the claim. And that's social engineering. So we'll have a look at the way it's done. Basically, a blanket statement which I can make with some confidence is that any fad, any scene, any trend, any movement which ends up involving millions of people, sweeping them up in its wake, can be proven to have occurred at the hands of social engineers. Because in the same way that you cannot become a famous rock star, a famous actor, a famous television presenter, a famous chef, a famous sports person, without having that kind of career handed to you by those that can make these sort of things happen, so it is that you can't have any fad, trend, movement, scene which has not been put in place by these same social engineers. These things do not happen randomly. They never grow organically by themselves. They're always put in place. We'll see plenty of examples as we move along. A statement which sums up this overall dynamic really well comes from a guy who knew what he was talking about. Edward Bernays, double nephew of Sigmund Freud, connected to that particular bloodline family, in the opening paragraph to his book, simply titled Propaganda, from 1928, he opened with, "We are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of." That overall dynamic remains as true today as it was when it was first written almost 100 years ago. Bernays was known as the father of public relations. He basically invented the concept of organisations, corporations, giving consideration to how they're thought about by the general public and shaping and moulding their image in line with those ideas. He was hired by many American corporations when he first unveiled this concept of public relations. And we've got a short video here talking about some of the ways in which Bernays was able to manipulate the general public into buying things, crap, which they didn't need. But through the subtle use of propaganda and clever psychological techniques, he got the job done. So let's take a look at this.
Bernays is almost completely unknown today, but his influence on the 20th century was nearly as great as his uncle's. Because Bernays was the first person to take Freud's ideas about human beings and use them to manipulate the masses. He showed American corporations for the first time how they could make people want things they didn't need by linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires.
So he's tapping into a lot of the work that was done by Freud himself there, in terms of the subconscious mind and how that can be harnessed and manipulated. We're going to be looking at a number of organisations which cause social engineering to get put into place as well. And one of the main culprits, which comes up endlessly in my research and has done for years, is the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London. It has a number of sister organisations, all with the Tavistock prefix. So if you see Tavistock anything, unless it's the town in Devon, then you can be sure that it's all about manipulating people against their best interests. This great book came out a few years ago by the author Daniel Esterlin, Social Engineering the Masses, and he really laid out some of the techniques that are used. So Tavistock had its roots as Wellington House, and we have a connection here into the world of the military. What we find is that when you get social engineering think tanks such as Tavistock, often they are directly connected into the world of military intelligence, different expressions of it. So Wellington House was the name for Britain's War Propaganda Bureau, operating in the First World War from a building on Buckingham Gate, just a stone's throw from Buckingham Palace, but sure that's just a coincidence, in London. And as I say, we'll see so many connections back into those institutions. Another great book was this one, which came out in 1991 by Dr. John Coleman. So he was a former British military intelligence insider, and he became a whistleblower and started spilling the beans on some of the stuff that he'd been involved with during his years with the service. So his book, Conspirators' Hierarchy, The Story of the Committee of 300, spelt out a lot of this. And specifically, he got into the Beatles, somewhat controversially. His claim was that the Beatles were a product of Tavistock, that they were effectively pieced together in the same way that a boy band is. So think Boyzone or One Direction. They were kind of assembled in the same way, just pieced together and put out there to push certain agendas. There is a reason why the Beatles became the most influential and prolific rock band of all time, in spite of the large number of rivals and contenders that they had. You don't get to be that successful and that prominent unless you're placed there. So this was Coleman's contention through this book. The unfortunate thing about what he said was that he didn't provide any direct citations or references. So we're largely left with his word for it, that that's what the Beatles were all about. But certainly from everything that I've researched and much of the stuff that I've seen, I would actually concur with that notion, and many other researchers into these fields do as well. Coleman went further and stated that the Beatles' rivals, it says here, they weren't actually rivals, as we'll see, the Rolling Stones, were also a product of Tavistock. And so he's claiming that what we were dealing with in the 1960s was a dialectic where both sides in this situation were controlled by the same forces. We see this so many times. We see it in politics, Conservative and Labour. It doesn't really make a difference which one you vote because the government wins either way, and the same globalist agendas get pushed through either way. So it didn't really make a difference in the 60s whether you were into the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, because both groups were being put out there to shape and mould society and steer it off in certain desired directions, all in line with other, more far-reaching agendas to do with societal manipulation. So it was the sex, drugs and rock and roll era, basically, and Coleman maintains that the Beatles played a very major role in that. In the book, he draws comparisons between Tavistock and another organisation out of Germany, simply known as the Frankfurt School. This is where the idea of cultural Marxism was born and perfected, so it was the origins of political correctness. And these were the principal figures behind these Marxist concepts coming out of Frankfurt: Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Jürgen Habermas. Theodore Adorno is the figure who is most of interest in this regard because Coleman claims that he, Freemason, surprise, surprise, an academic, also a classical music scholar, who frowned on popular music culture, was responsible for writing much of the music that's been credited to the Beatles. This is Coleman's claim. Again, there's no direct evidence to show that this was the case, but Adorno's name does come up quite often in these research realms. There's some great work that's been done by a guy named Mike Williams, who's known as Sage of Quay. He's done hours and hours and hours of research into the Beatles, who used to be his favourite group. So Mike's a musician himself, and the Beatles were a big influence on him, but he's come to view them in a different light in recent years, simply through having done the research that any of us can do. And Mike has put out many videos proving that it's impossible for Lennon and McCartney to have written the large number of songs that they've been credited with, literally hundreds. Mike has honed in on certain periods in the Beatles' career where it's on public record that they were touring, doing chat shows, appearing on TV shows, attending to family business, in the studio, whatever. And he's shown that with all that taken into consideration, it's impossible for them also to have written the large number of songs and rehearsed them and performed them and recorded them and edited them and produced them in the time that we're told they did. So from that, we can certainly conclude that other parties were responsible for writing many of the songs that have been credited to the Beatles. Doesn't necessarily prove that it was Theodore Adorno, but it remains a popular theory either way. It all ties into what's known, or what was known as the Aquarian conspiracy. So Adorno was affiliated with the Stanford Research Institute in the United States. This is the closest thing America has to Tavistock. It's all about social policy, social engineering by any other name. So in the 1960s, they came up with this idea known as the Aquarian conspiracy, put together by the SRI director, Professor Willis Harman, and a document known as the Changing Images of Man. This was all about the incoming age of Aquarius, which was being spoken about in the late 1960s, and apparently we're still waiting for that now. Nobody seems to know when it's going to happen or if it's happened, but in the late 1960s, it was really a thing. What with the musical Hair and the song, the dawning of the age of Aquarius and all this. So this was the title of this agenda, which was tied in with the counterculture stuff in the 1960s and that engineering of sex and drugs and rock and roll and all these different lifestyles that were being unleashed on the young people of the time. So the Beatles became a highly visible new type in Tavistock jargon, according to this article, and as such it was not long before the group made new styles, fads in clothing, hairstyles and language usage that upset the older generation, as was intended. So in this time, as well as those hairstyles changing and the changing fashions and such, there was new language coming in, like the use of the word hippie. And apparently that goes back to the days of opium usage, when that was really a popular thing, opium houses, where people would go in and lie on their hips and get high. And from that we get the word hippie. That was the origin of it. And then you had phrases like, yeah, cool man, far out and groovy and stuff like this. And those words didn't come about by accident. It was social engineers who put that into the culture of the times. And it was tied in with the drugs. Most of the drugs were coming out of the CIA. There's evidence, there's documentation to prove this was the case. Specifically the LSD that was everywhere in America in the 60s. Also a fair bit of it in London as well. And then other things like marijuana and other types of drugs, other entheogens, mescaline and magic mushrooms and peyote and stuff like this was everywhere in the 60s. And the supply lines can be traced directly back to the CIA in so many cases. So it really was sex and drugs and rock and roll. The Beatles were right at the forefront of it. And there were really two distinct phases to the Beatles' career. When they first emerged in 1962 and were unleashed upon the public with the lineup that we now know, because initially they were a five-piece band. Pete Best was in place as the original drummer before he was replaced by Ringo, and the original bassist was a young lad by the name of Stuart Sutcliffe, who died at the ripe old age of 21 of a brain aneurysm. And once he had, Paul McCartney was put into place as the bassist in that group, and we ended up with the lineup that we know, who first appeared with their single Love Me Do. That was released on the 5th of October 1962, which was the very same day that the first James Bond movie, Dr. No, was released. So we had two very British institutions, both of which have been involved with certain types of propaganda, societal mind control, both getting introduced to the world on the very same day. Dates were everything with the Beatles. We can see from recording dates of many of their popular songs and the release dates of their albums. So that's them in 1962. And they were this clean-cut, lovable band that was singing boy meets girl love songs. She loves you, I want to hold your hand. They were very family friendly. By 1966, midway through their career, a very definite change had started to occur, with songs like Tomorrow Never Knows, based on Timothy Leary's interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So we're getting into occult mystery school studies here, which were a big part of that whole 60s counterculture thing. And then by 1967, which was dubbed the Summer of Love, and again, these phrases don't come about by accident. They are concocted, they are invented in line with agendas. The Beatles had released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Very psychedelic, very trippy, very far out, very different to their earlier music. And we had more of the same at the end of 1967 with Magical Mystery Tour, the album, and the movie of the same name. And they'd started to look different. Not only was the sound different, but the fashions were different. Oh, and they'd switched out Paul McCartney. Let's not forget to mention that. What we're looking at here is two different McCartneys. It is. We have McCartney 1.0 at the top, and there's quite a few discrepancies facially, in terms of height, and in terms of all kinds of other features with McCartney 2.0 down here. So there was this very popular conspiracy theory, which first emerged in 1966, stating that the original Paul McCartney died in a car accident and was replaced by an imposter who's been playing the public role to this very day. The date that is most commonly given for that event is 9/11 of 66. There is no tangible proof that the original Paul McCartney died. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. There's a lot of cryptic and occult clues which were placed into Beatles music and Beatles album sleeves and such. But one thing we can say, or I certainly can, with a certain degree of confidence, is there has been more than one Paul McCartney. And we're looking at two of them here. There may have been more than two in terms of other doubles and stand-ins, but we've definitely been looking at two individuals playing that public role. So there's a cause for concern there. One of the most famous musicians and songwriters of the last 100 years was switched out, and most people don't even realise it. That kind of bothers me. This is kind of information that I think people should know, which is why I do this. So the Beatles were pushing agendas. In the 1960s, as well as what was coming out of California, the LSD, the psychedelic rock culture, in London, there was a homegrown scene which went hand in hand with the counterculture at the time. And this was the avant-garde art scene, largely centred around London. So in June of 1966, this record sleeve was released by Capitol Records in the United States for the Beatles album Yesterday and Today. So as you can see, it involves mutilated babies, dolls, with limbs missing, and raw meat being draped all over the Beatles, who were sat there in white butcher's smocks. This was said to be an avant-garde art statement at the time, which was June 66, so it's 666, which just happens to be a favoured number of the dark occult controllers of these institutions. And the photography was done by an Australian photographer by the name of Robert Whittaker. It was one of 12 photographs that he took in this set. And it was defended by them saying, oh, we were just pushing the envelope and just trying to be artistic, and it was avant-garde and it was in keeping with the spirit of the times. But I think there are far darker things being communicated through this album sleeve. Possibly some of the behind-the-scenes activities which might go on with the so-called elites of this world. Anyway, there was a lot of controversy and a lot of furore over this particular album sleeve, and so it was very promptly withdrawn and replaced with another one, which involved the three Beatles gathered around a steamer chest, a sea chest that used to be used in the days of seafaring, and inside the chest was sat Paul McCartney. And so the sea chest symbolically could be seen to represent a coffin, and this ties in with the whole idea that the original Paul is actually dead and was replaced. But either way, if anyone has an original copy of this album knocking around in their loft or garage, you're rich, because it currently goes at auction for several £100,000. Other bands coming out of the UK who were pushing psychedelic culture in those early days included Pink Floyd, or as they were known in the 60s, the Big Pink Floyd, with the original frontman Syd Barrett, the original singer-songwriter, still in place. So Syd was removed from the band very early on, 1967. They'd only just started to break through to prominence by that point with their first hit single, See Emily Play. And after the second single, Arnold Lane, Syd had to be removed from the band. The official story is that he'd fried his brains through doing too much LSD, and he'd become unreliable, and he just had to be taken out of the scene and replaced by David Gilmour. I think there's more to that story. I do have a suspicious mind, but the research bears it out. Syd Barrett's father was involved in research connected to Cambridge University, all to do with mind control techniques and the way that the human psyche can be manipulated. So it's my contention that Syd was used as a test subject for many of the experiments that his father was involved with, and it didn't go too well, and it turned Syd into a victim of MKUltra style mind control. So that's why he had to be removed from the scene. So very early on, the Pink Floyd were involved in pushing this acid culture in line with what was coming out of the United States. And then a few years later, they'd had a complete makeover themselves and become an entirely different band in terms of how they looked and in terms of how they sounded. So that very trippy psychedelic sound of their early releases had been replaced by the prog rock sound that we all know and best for, Dark Side of the Moon and all the rest of it. And the image had changed along with it. A lot of people are of the view that Roger Waters, out of that group, is someone who's kind of on our side and is a voice for the people. Certainly, he's had a lot of very worthwhile things to say. He's been very vocal about the Zionist state of Israel and their genocidal incursions into their neighbouring Palestine. And if you take his comments on that issue alone, at face value, you might conclude that Roger is someone with a mind of his own who is paying attention to what's going on and is saying what needs to be said. However, you do need to take the entire picture of what he has to say in trying to assess his character and his possible motives. So during the COVID debacle, Roger did an interview where he praised all the wonderful people that were working behind the scenes to keep this terrible pandemic at bay. And he said, lots of great people, wonderful people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, and lots of good people like Bill Gates. So, as far as I'm concerned, it takes about 30 seconds of research to discover the true nature of people like Fauci, Gates, who they represent, what they're trying to achieve. Someone of Roger's intelligence is able to do that research. So if he's coming out with statements like that, he's someone that I just have to jettison and let go. And I can make another blanket statement with some confidence, which is anyone in the public eye, anyone famous, any household name, anyone you've heard of, is controlled, is owned, is unable to make statements off their own back without them having been pre-approved by other parties beforehand. You can't trust a single damn one of them. And that might sound like a very sweeping statement, but by the time we've looked at a few more examples, hopefully you might agree with me. Dr. Timothy Leary, he was put out there as a hero of the counterculture in the 1960s. He was this Harvard professor out the world of academia, and he started pushing the idea of his students exploring their consciousness and going on these journeys of self-discovery through using LSD. And at the time, he was considered authentic. He was kicked out of his role. He was arrested for pushing the use of marijuana, and he seemed the genuine article. However, in later years, in many interviews that he gave, he admitted to having been an asset of the CIA. And he stated that all the drugs, mainly the LSD, in those times were coming through CIA supply lines. And so Leary was an actor, playing a role, popularising the use of all this stuff in line with more far-reaching agendas. Also at the time, we had Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters. This was this band of dropouts that used to drive around California in this multicoloured psychedelic bus, distributing free tabs of acid wherever they went. Where was it all coming from? Because it was endless supplies. Money seemed to be no problem, the supply lines were open, nobody was getting arrested, and all these hippie communes and these music festivals, LSD was appearing everywhere, nobody was getting arrested. Why? Because it was coming through the CIA. Ken Kesey was another asset of the CIA. He was an author. He wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, later made into the movie starring Jack Nicholson. He was also an inmate at one of the MKUltra hospitals. MKUltra was a very far-reaching program of societal mind control, sponsored by, I'm glad you're all sitting down to recover from the shock, those nice people at the CIA. You know, those people who are in place to keep Americans safe from harm and represent their interests. Same thing that MI5 and MI6 does here on British shores. They're just keeping us safe. Just like James Bond, you know, gallant heroes going out there, prepared to do whatever it takes just to keep us all safe from harm. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. We live in a satanically inverted society where the opposite of what we're presented with turns out to be the truth. So organisations like the CIA, MI5, MI6, Tavistock are not there to keep us safe from harm. They're there to cause the harm. That's their job. So the 60s were all about changing societal attitudes. And it was pitting the young generation of the time, so-called baby boomers. So it's the generation born towards the end of the Second World War and in the years immediately following, who were coming of age in the mid to late 1960s. They were the ones in the crosshairs of the social engineers at the time. And they wanted to drive a wedge between that youthful generation and their parents' generation and set them at odds in terms of their value systems. So the parents' generation were all about more conservative, more traditional, old-fashioned values that they'd grown up on, and the social engineers wanted their offspring to be hooked on drugs, psychedelic music, and sexually promiscuous lifestyles, and all other kinds of social changes, so that there would be a complete division within society. The controllers get off on providing division between the different sectors in society. So another way that this was achieved was through changing attitudes towards sex and family, and this involved a figure named Gloria Steinem, who was known as the mother of modern feminism in America of the time, the proprietor of Ms. magazine. It was all about expounding these ideas that females were equal in every way in society to their male counterparts. So there's no reason why they couldn't be out there in the workplace doing all the jobs that the men are doing. But the fallout from that was that it involved getting large numbers of women out of the home, away from the traditional nurturing roles of motherhood, which they'd traditionally been involved with up to that point, and instead into the workplace, getting their children put into state so-called care and indoctrination at ever earlier ages, with the added bonus of contributing even more to the taxation system by having that many more people working in corporate roles. So Gloria Steinem's role was to popularise that whole idea, and would you believe it, she also turned out to have been an asset on the payroll of the CIA. Is it just me, or is there a pattern emerging here? There'll be quite a few more. The Grateful Dead can be largely seen as the poster children, the house band of that whole counterculture era. Bit of suspect occult symbolism on most of their albums. And when we get into the personnel in that band, it does not disappoint. Through the various members, we find direct connections into Freemasonry, other occult secret societies and mystery schools, Bohemian Grove, out there in California, the Century Club, its counterpart in New York on the East Coast. We find connections into aristocratic bloodline families going back many generations, and we find connections back into expressions of military intelligence. The public think they're just some greased out stoner band. Fans of the Grateful Dead refer to themselves as deadheads. That's another phrase that was put out there by the social engineers. The fans think it's a term of endearment. They'll say, yeah man, I'm a deadhead. What they don't realise is that that accounts to a cult mockery on their part at the hands of those who invented them and put them out there. They see those who fall for social engineering psyops easily and manufactured fake heroes as deadheads, and they love to mock us, them, to our faces. It's part of their occult satanic belief system. So there's nothing endearing about referring to yourself as a deadhead, trust me. They see the likes of us as spiritually dead and ignorant and profane. And they like to remind us of it in cryptic coded form as often as they can. Unfortunately for them, many of us now are learning to recognise these cryptic coded ways of communication. And that's only going to continue. We have a direct connection from the Grateful Dead back into Tavistock through this fellow, Eric Trist. Here he is. Eric Lansdowne Trist, born on 11th of September, would you believe? What's in a date? Was an English scientist and a leading figure in the field of organisational development. He was one of the founders of the Tavistock Institute for Social Research in London. Why is that important? Well, meet his son, Alan Trist. So Alan Trist just happened to be the music publisher and one-time road manager for the aforementioned Grateful Dead. So a greased out band of stoners just happened to recruit the son of one of the major behavioural scientists in London as their road manager. But nothing to worry about there. Happens all the time. No, really, it does. Another road manager for the Grateful Dead was a guy by the name of Hank Harrison, who turns out to be the biological father of Courtney Love, partner of Kurt Cobain of Nirvana fame. He also turns out to have been, one time, in the employ of the CIA. What else could it have been? Rock bands of the time used to help push those agendas include The Doors. We're getting into the work now of the late great author and researcher Dave McGowan, who put out a book in 2014 titled Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. It focused on the Laurel Canyon district in the Hollywood Hills of LA. And McGowan had noticed that pretty much every influential group and musician from that counterculture era, changing times, changing attitudes, for some reason was congregating in this Laurel Canyon neighborhood. Also in the neighborhood was a covert military research installation known as Lookout Mountain, where many famous people had worked in undercover roles. And McGowan's further digging revealed that in the case of every one of these famous musicians, there were family connections into different expressions of the military and military intelligence. So CIA, FBI, DOD, Pentagon, different expressions of government, the Army, the Navy, the Marines, every band, no exceptions. No one's dad's a plumber. This is going to be the title of one of my future talks, because when it comes to rock bands, I would expect the dads to be things like plumbers, builders, bus drivers, dockers, construction workers, you know. We don't find that. But we do find plenty of lecturers, professors, diplomats, lord mayors, politicians, generals, admirals, plenty of those, no shortage. And a great example comes from Jim Morrison, frontman of The Doors, who were a group right there at the forefront of that ostensibly anti-establishment, anti-war generation. Here, top left, we have a picture of a young James Douglas Morrison with his father. He's on the bridge of the ship that he commanded. That's him there on the right, Admiral George Stephen Morrison. So he just happened to be the Navy Admiral in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag event, which was used to justify America ramping up the Vietnam War, with the body count of who knows how many millions following in its wake. So somehow we have to reconcile the idea of the son in his role as frontman of The Doors, pushing drugs, pushing these alternative psychedelic lifestyles to one generation, and his father belonging to another generation who's out there effectively springboarding the Vietnam War. How can we make sense of this? Well, the only way you can make sense of it is down to the fact that Jim Morrison was an actor, as so many of these famous people are. They are literally playing roles. So there he is in that first picture with short hair, looking very clean cut. And then by just 1 year later, he's grown his hair out, he's hooked up with his bandmates in The Doors, they've got all these songs, they've got this image, they've got this stage performance, and they're pushing all these different ideas out there on the public stage in the space of 1 year. And to further reinforce the point, here is a video which you can still get on YouTube. It's an ad for Florida State University from 1964. See if you recognize anyone in this commercial.
But will the university be ready to meet his ambitions? Will his parents have been sufficiently interested in his future to have concerned themselves with the needs of their universities?
We regret to inform you that we are unable to accept your application.
Unless we face facts today, this could happen to many Florida boys and girls tomorrow. For in 10 years, roughly 3 times as many of your sons and daughters will be seeking admission to Florida's state universities. What will we answer them?
We'd like to accept you. Indeed, we'd like to offer more courses, more sections, but we just don't have the space. That together with the lack of professors.
But what happened? How come my parents at the state and university didn't look ahead?
Looking ahead, planning ahead, that's...
All right, so you get the idea. What we're looking at there is a young Jim Morrison taking part in that commercial a year or so before he had been presented to the world as the frontman of The Doors. looking very different, playing a very different role. And it's the offspring of military personnel who are often put to use in social engineering agendas. They pick them from within those ranks because they believe that these are families that can be trusted to stay true to what's been set out for them. Another organisation in London, rather similar to Tavistock in many of its activities, is the LSE, the London School of Economics. So most graduates of the LSE end up with careers in business, finance, law, that sort of thing. There was one very famous graduate of the LSE who ended up with a very different career as a grizzled, debaucherous, hedonistic rock star. He's been playing the role for nigh on 60 years. Mick Jagger. So what was he doing at LSE? And how come he emerged from it with the kind of career that we all know him for? Well, it's because the LSE is involved in shaping and moulding culture and societal attitudes in the same way as its other counterparts like Tavistock. It's what they specialise in. So Jagger came out there as the front man of the Rolling Stones, and he was pushing the same agendas as the Beatles in many ways, pushing LSD. Also the idea of androgyny, the blurring of the genders. He was a very early pusher of that in the 1960s before it really became a thing in the 70s with the likes of David Bowie and many of these glam rock acts. So this is Jagger in the video to Sympathy for the Devil, 1967, and he's wearing lipstick and eyeshadow. More of the same in the movie Performance, alongside James Fox. It was the same ideas being pushed into popular culture and being made very appealing to the young people of the time. The Rolling Stones also had the album Their Satanic Majesty's Request, catchy title, huh? Which was a sort of pastiche of the Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper's. This was released 6 months on in December of 1967, and it involved the Rolling Stones getting involved in psychedelic music and pushing various occult themes. So here's Jagger with his wizard's hat with a crescent moon on it, and we've got Saturn hovering ominously overhead, and also cleverly hidden in the sleeve design to this album are the 4 faces of the members of the Beatles, kind of showing that the groups were very far from rivals but were actually on the same side, involved in the same sort of activities. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were actually friends. They used to go out and socialise and party together, very far from rivals. I learned a lot about the whole concept of culture creation and lifetime actors from Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill, a great podcast series which they had a few years ago titled Unspun. The unfortunate thing is that they fell out and no longer speak to each other because Jan Irvin turned on Joe Atwill and accused him of being a CIA operative. But Joe shouldn't take it too personally because unfortunately Jan turns on everyone he's ever worked with and accuses them of being CIA operatives. He seems deeply paranoid. It's a great shame because he was a phenomenal researcher, and these two did put out some really great shows in the years that they worked together. So I learned all about the lifetime actor. This was a term that was coined by Joe Atwill. It addresses individuals who have become household names through their public personas. The aforementioned Bill Gates is a great example. But their backgrounds usually tell a different story, revealing family links to military intelligence or other aspects of social control. In Gates's case, his father, William H. Gates Sr., had been head of the Planned Parenthood organisation, which had evolved out of the American Eugenics Society. An insight into the mindset of these people comes from comments made by Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood's founder, who said, "The most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it." And also, human weeds, reckless breeders, spawning human beings who should never have been born, in describing immigrants and the working class. Nice lady. So this is the kind of mindset that Bill Gates has adopted, that he's had handed down to him through his father, He's all about eugenics, the removal of undesirable sectors within human society and population reduction. He's also heading up the worldwide vaccination program. So, what could possibly go wrong? More on Mick Jagger came from a lady named Anne Diamond, not the British TV presenter, but this one's real name was Anne McLean, but she goes by the name of Anne Diamond. She claims to have been an inmate at McGill University in Montreal, the Allen Memorial. This was one of the most notorious MKUltra hospitals where Dr. Ewan Cameron, one of the most notorious doctors involved in that scheme, did mind control experiments on inmates, many of them children. So she states that she herself was a child when she was experimented upon by Cameron under MKUltra. And during her time there, she told me in an interview that I did with her a couple of years ago, she recalls a young Mick Jagger, who she says at the time was simply known as Michael. But she claims that she's got very vivid memories of him having been present at McGill at the time she herself was there. In this audio excerpt, she's going into her relationship with Leonard Cohen, singer-songwriter, who was a counterculture hero from 1967 onwards, when he just emerged fully formed as a singer-songwriter performer at the age of 33, but I'm sure there's nothing in that, and very rapidly got propelled to fame and fortune, another example of an engineered career. So in this audio excerpt, she's talking about some of the other agendas that rock music was being used for during the time that she was getting mind controlled at McGill University.
McGill was connected with Tavistock, okay?
Yeah.
And some of the psychiatrists who were programming patients, but I think particularly children at McGill in the 1950s were the same psychiatrists that, they would have known either known or been the same people that were at Tavistock. There was an entertainment music connection, and part of what was going on at McGill in the centre of Montreal, which had been the jazz capital of Canada and North America, well, like New Orleans and New York, was that they were programming artists and musicians in particular, because the Air Force owned EMI, the recording studio in London, where the Stones and the Beatles recorded, and they had developed a form of mind control programming using electronic signals, right? And they were expanding that. And the top psychiatrist, Dr. Cameron at the Allen Memorial, used to talk and write about how rock and roll music could be the vector of mental illness. He said you could create rock stars who were mentally ill, and then they could spread mental illness to a whole population, which was really his goal, was to make everyone schizophrenic and controllable through drugs and different forms of electronics and so on.
So that's what it was all about. And she states that she was in a 20-year relationship with Leonard Cohen. And during that time, he would fly around the world, ostensibly in the role of a performer to perform concerts and such, but actually he was undertaking espionage missions on behalf of the CIA and Mossad. She claims he was a spy for both. And he had a habit of turning up at various places in the world where rock stars would end up getting assassinated. So he was in London in September 1970 when Jimi Hendrix turned up dead. The official account is that he choked on his own vomit after ingesting barbiturates. But the truth of the matter is that Jimi Hendrix was actually murdered at the hands of his manager, Michael Jeffrey, who just happened to be an employee of British military intelligence. It was all to do with his song publishing, getting their hands on his fortune. Then, 10 years later, in December of 1980, she says, Leonard showed up in New York right at the time that John Lennon was assassinated outside the Dakota building. And then a few days after that, Leonard buggered off again and holed himself up on an obscure Greek island for several months. we can make of that what we will. Going back to the LSE, there are other famous graduates of it, and one of them is the very well-known club and radio DJ, Judge Jules, real name Julius O'Riordan. This headline article asks, is Rick Stein related to Judge Jules? They got the is in the wrong place in the sentence. It should state Rick Stein is related to Judge Jules. So Rick Stein, the celebrity chef, turns out to be an uncle of Judge Jules, and this is a prime example of what we find over and over again when it comes to famous people. They're all related. Most of them are cousins to each other, but one way or another, it comes down to certain family bloodlines. Members of these families are elevated into these prominent positions at the expense of all other contenders. So, as we can see from this, Jules studied law at the London School of Economics and earned the name Judge Jules when he started DJing at parties. So he was one of the prominent figures in the very early acid house rave scene in the UK in the late 1980s onwards. One of the major DJs at those early raves, alongside names like Carl Cox and many others. So this brings us to another scene, fact, trend, movement, the acid house rave scene of the late 1980s. So the summers of 1988 and 89 were known as the second summers of love, dubbed that way by the mainstream media of the time. And of course, picking up on the verbiage from the 60s of the original Summer of Love in 1967. So straight away there, as far as I'm concerned, we've got a bit of a red flag, because the media themselves are drawing comparisons between these two scenes. And there are many parallels. So in the 60s, it was all about psychedelic rock music coming along to replace the forms that had been there previously. In the 80s, it was all about new forms of electronically produced dance music coming along to replace what had been there previously. In the 60s, drugs were everywhere, most prominently LSD, and the supply lines can be demonstrated to have come directly from the CIA. In the late 80s, drugs were everywhere. This time it was mainly ecstasy, MDMA. That was the popular drug of choice, and it was absolutely everywhere. A few small-time dealers used to get busted for selling pills at raves, but the drug barons, the real kingpins, the overlords, never seemed to get arrested. No police crackdowns on them. It's almost as if the drugs were being allowed to get put into society. And then the other common factor between these scenes was simply the togetherness, the sense of unity that young people at the time felt. So in the 60s, all the hippies would get together, do acid, trip out to psychedelic music, and just feel that bond of togetherness and pool their consciousness. And the same thing was happening with these acid house parties in the 80s and beyond, because this was the early genesis of a worldwide clubbing culture scene, which is still with us today. So it's Saturday night, in a few hours, in this nation and many others, young people will be going out to clubs and doing drugs in many cases, listening to electronic dance music. And this is where it all began, almost 40 years ago, but I would suggest at the hands of social engineers. This was not a random, organic grassroots movement. Despite what many original ravers will claim, they'll say it was authentic back in the day, but I've seen enough to convince me that this scene bears all the very same hallmarks that we've seen so many times, with so many music scenes in so many decades, with so many different styles, so many different fashions, and so many different drugs. Because one thing I've noticed is that every time you get a new scene, it comes with an approved drug of choice. It seems to be part and parcel of the package. And by the way, I was there in 1988 and beyond. I was just of the right kind of age to be rife for manipulation myself, and I fell for this whole thing. I wasn't a DJ on this scene. I became a DJ a bit later. and I mainly played hip hop and R&B and stuff like that, rather than dance music. But I did go clubbing back in these days, and I loved it. I thought it was great. It spoke to me, it spoke to my generation. It was something my parents didn't understand, and I thought that was great. And that's all part of it. That's what they want. They want young people into things that their parents just don't get, because it destroys the cohesion, the unity within society, and instead drives a wedge between the different generations. So this was simply more of the same. It came with its own emblem as well, the smiley yellow face, which has been making something of a resurgence in recent times. I've noticed the smiley yellow face is everywhere right now, and it means something. I don't yet know quite what, but there are some very disturbing occult overtones to this symbol, I would suggest, certainly in the way it's now being used. One recent example ties into the very bizarre reported death of the actor Matthew Perry, who pictured himself on his social media account with a cushion fashioned in the style of one of these smiley yellow faces in one of the very last posts before he turned up dead in his jacuzzi. Death by jacuzzi. There's a lot of it around, it seems. Also, right around that time, we had a new single released by the German trance DJ and producer, what's in a name? Paul van Dyk, out of Berlin. So this guy's been around for 30 years or so. He's an absolute titan of the genre of electronic dance music simply known as trance. He's got a fan base in the millions. He's revered as a demigod within that scene. And he put out this track a few months ago with DJ Pierre, who was one of the original producers of the acid house sound coming out of the United States in the 80s. So it's called Acid Tracks, and this was the emblem that went with it on the sleeve. There's a promotional advertising campaign which involves a girl going around city centres on a skateboard, pasting up these smiley yellow faces everywhere she goes. And to me, it's really quite disturbing, particularly when you factor in that the slits being used for the eyes in this smiley yellow face are very similar to the logo used by the Schutzstaffel, known as the SS, coming out of Nazi Germany. Appears to be the very same emblem, and bearing in mind that Paul van Dyk is a German producer and DJ. He's also had this very bizarre occult symbol which has appeared in his artwork for many years. And I racked my brains for a long while to try and figure out what it could mean. And then I stumbled by accident upon this logo, which I've just flipped up the other way, for British Military Intelligence, MI5, where you've got the same triangle with the corners cut out in the same fashion as in this logo. So I wonder if that could be a subtle clue being offered to us. Either way, there's much more to know about these smiley yellow faces. There's been a spate of murders in recent years in America, but there's also been counterparts right here in the UK, which have come to be known as the smiley face killings. It involves young men who go missing after going out drinking and partying. They're not seen for several days, and then their bodies are found in water, rivers, lakes, creeks, and in the area, a smiley face has been daubed in graffiti onto a tree trunk or a rock or something similar. There's an investigative journalist by the name of William Ramsey who's been looking into this phenomenon. And I'm doing an interview with him in a few weeks to get right up to date on where we're at with this smiley face emblem and what he thinks it might currently be being used to communicate. So that'll be an interesting one. Other scenes to look at, one which I was also into big time myself, rap and hip hop. So the thing about the musical style of rap is that it comes with its whole lifestyle attached, a culture. It's not just about the music. There are 5 essential pillars of hip hop culture. we get taught. So as well as the rapping, the MCing, you've also got the breakdancing, you've got the graffiti art element of it, you've got the turntablism, and then the fifth element is known as knowledge of self. It's like a spiritual component to it. And these can be seen as representations of the essential elements of earth, air, fire, water, spirit. But also, according to a very fascinating guy who I interviewed a few years ago, who goes by the name of the Black Dot, he's a scholar of American hip-hop culture, he maintains that these 5 pillars of this culture are a reimagining of African tribal cultures. So when Africans were taken over to the American continent, they brought with them some of their ancestral memories of these traditions. So where you've got the MC, the rapper, conveying messages through words, that's a reinterpretation of the griot, the storyteller, the elder within African tribes who would pass on messages and knowledge. When you've got the break dancers, this is a reimagining of tribal ceremonial dancing coming from those traditions. Where you've got the turntablist who's scratching out rhythms on turntables, this is a reinterpretation of the drummer within tribal ceremonies, tapping out rhythms. The graffiti art is hieroglyphics, which would have been a part of those ancient cultures. And then you've got the fifth element, which is spirit or knowledge of self, the spiritual component. So it would appear that hip-hop culture started out, at least on the surface, with some noble intent before rap music was steered off down some very different and much darker roads. But I've now started asking all kinds of questions about the origins of hip-hop culture and whether it happened as organically as we're led to believe it did. So hip-hop just celebrated its 50th anniversary. It's said to have all begun in the Bronx area of New York City in 1973. That's when the first block parties were thrown, where for the first time there were DJs performing on sound systems, cutting up rhythms on 2 turntables, and things like the breakdancing and then the rapping on the mic followed in its wake. There are 3 figures who are revered as the founding fathers of hip-hop culture. One of them is Kool Herc, who is a DJ from a Jamaican family who popularised the idea of the block party, of setting up turntables in the park, in the street, powering them using street lamps, and then scratching out rhythms and playing breaks from tracks on 2 different turntables at the same time. That art form was taken further by Grandmaster Flash, who is said to be the inventor of turntablism, the idea of scratching and manipulating records as if they were musical instruments. Then you've got Afrika Bambaataa, this guy. Real name Lance Taylor. For many years his Wikipedia entry stated that his name was Kevin Donovan. But some investigative research by a journalist in the States, by Layla Wills, revealed that his real name was actually Lance Taylor, and then his Wikipedia entry miraculously changed overnight to reflect this. So he started this organisation known as the Universal Zulu Nation, and it came out of certain street gangs in the Bronx area of New York. The Bronx River Organisation and the Black Spades kind of morphed into the Zulu Nation. For many decades, Bambaataa was hailed as a hero of the hip-hop scene, of inventing different elements of the culture. In 2016, 2 men who had been a part of the Universal Zulu Nation in their youth accused Bambaataa of having sexually molested them when they were minors. A guy by the name of Ronald Savage and another by the name of Hassan Campbell. In their wake came many other allegations of a similar nature against Bambaataa, and the leadership of the Universal Zulu Nation was forced to admit that his predilection towards teenage boys was a best kept secret within the organisation. So Bambaataa's image was tarnished in that regard, This was 2016, so we're getting on for 8 years since, and no action has been taken against him whatsoever. He's still a free man. Not only that, but he's still getting booked to perform at shows. It's as if many who are heavily invested in hip-hop culture and its heritage just do not want to accept the true nature of Bambaataa. And if this were an isolated story, we could write it off as just an unfortunate incident, like Jimmy Savile being a lone operator within the BBC, you know, just a bad apple, just one that slipped through the net. I think we know better than that. And it's far from the only example that we get within hip-hop culture. I'm also suspicious now about the naming of some of these founding fathers of this scene. So, Grand Master Flash. This seems to me to come straight out of the ranks of Freemasonry. We then have Grand Wizard Theodore, who is hailed as one of the greatest turntablists, going back to the early days of hip-hop. So Grand Wizard sounds to me like something out of a sort of mind control cult or some sort of occult secret society. So I'm getting quite suspicious about these different elements now. We're also getting allegations against many prominent figures coming out of the world of hip-hop, such as Sean Combs, known previously as Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, Diddy, Diddley, or whatever the hell he's calling himself this week. Seems to change his name rather a lot. So all kinds of allegations are coming forward from various women about sexual impropriety on the part of this guy. He's one of the richest men in hip-hop, proprietor of Bad Boy Records. He's a businessman, he's an overlord of the scene, as well as being a really bad rapper. And he's the guy that put Notorious B.I.G. on the scene, Biggie Smalls, just a short while before he was assassinated in a hail of bullets in March 1997. Very suspicious event, happening 6 months after almost exactly the same thing happened to the rapper Tupac Shakur back in September of '96. So it seems that Diddley's world is beginning to unravel right now. Turns out his father, Melvin Combs, was a small-time gangster hustler who was within the employ of Frank Lucas. He's the character portrayed by Denzel Washington in the movie American Gangster, who had links to the CIA in terms of pushing street drugs. So that's where Diddy comes from. Next thing you know, he's being put out there as one of the major CEOs within corporate hip-hop. By the time he'd come along, rap music had started to talk about flossing, balling, gold chains, champagne, velvet rope VIP sections in the club, fur coats, Gucci, Armani, all these fashion brands, Cristal, all this nonsense, which had absolutely no bearing on the original lyrical themes being pushed by rap music. When it wasn't that, it was the glorification of criminal lifestyles, talking about drive-by shootings, pushing crack cocaine, this kind of thing, bitches, hoes, all of this. And all of that was put into hip-hop music by design. There's much evidence to show that gangster rap, that whole genre, and these lyrical themes were deliberately inserted into that culture by design, to degrade it, to debase it, to make it meaningless, to steer its audience in the millions around the world off in certain desired directions. And the agendas that so-called rap and hip-hop music is being used to push now don't even bear thinking about. It makes the stuff that was being pushed in the 90s appear tame by comparison. Blatant Satanism, blatant embracing of transgenderism, transhumanism, and all these other current woke agendas. Then we have R. Kelly, who was an R&B singer, but he was always closely associated with the hip-hop scene and collaborated with major rap artists. So a couple of years ago, we got some serious allegations against R. Kelly in terms of... Oh dear, okay. Oh, there we go. Somebody didn't like me talking about R. Kelly. So yeah, there's lots to know about him. There have been many allegations put his way, and it all amounts to sexual perversion of one kind or another. So is it a coincidence that all these giant names of the scene have all been embroiled in scandals of this nature? This brings us to the most prominent and influential DJ on the rap and hip-hop scene in the UK, Tim Westwood. He's a guy that I used to look up to. As a DJ myself in the 90s, playing this sort of music, Westwood was on Capital Radio. His Capital Rap Show was the go-to place if you wanted to be up on all the latest releases and all the cool stuff coming out of American hip-hop. These days, he's no hero of mine anymore. There have been allegations made against him by multiple women, accusing him of having sexually molested them, going back more than 40 years. The first claim goes back to 1982, and he wasn't even famous back then. So these are all black women who state that when they were teenage girls, Westwood took advantage of them using his role, his public position, as a way of getting close to them. We know somebody else who used to be a BBC DJ who used to do that, don't we? And this is relevant to these parts as well, because Tim Westwood, Timothy William Westwood, to give him his real name, attended public school right here in Norwich. Norwich School, which was attended by Lord Nelson and a great many prominent politicians and public figures. So it ain't just for your average old riffraff off the street, don't you know? So he was a public schoolboy, and he was the son of the Reverend Bill Westwood, known as Bishop Bill, the one-time Bishop of Peterborough. He used to produce the Thought for the Day feature on BBC Radio 4. Tim Westwood is his son. You couldn't make it up. So what's an upper-class public schoolboy doing, becoming the most prominent DJ within a culture and art form which you wouldn't necessarily equate with someone of his background and upbringing? Not the only example we have of it. The exact same dynamic is at play within the reggae scene, where the most prominent and influential DJ for many decades has been a guy by the name of David Rodigan, MBE. So he also is an upper-class public schoolboy. He's a trained actor, and he comes from a military family. He was raised on various military air bases in Germany before relocating back to the UK. So he's a white, posh public schoolboy, and he's at the forefront of the reggae scene within the UK, which is a black art form, black culture. So it's understandable that many black people are rather pissed off with the fact that their culture, music forms that have come out of their communities, are being presided over by middle-class public schoolboys, such as this. What we're looking at is the application of gatekeepers, approved individuals put into positions where they can keep an eye on how certain cultures evolve, help to implement certain agendas within them, and make sure that things go according to wider reaching plans. Another great example of a gatekeeper would be Pete Tong, who's another radio and club DJ that I used to look up to in my early years. These days I know better. He's an MBE as well. And he refers to himself on his social media as the Pied Piper of dance. That's as good as an admission in my book that he's a gatekeeper. He's telling you, because the Pied Piper in the story of legend led all the children from a town away from their parents, from the townsfolk, to their doom, away from the town. Russell Brand had a children's book all about the Pied Piper, and he referred to himself in that way. It's not really something to be proud of, it's not really a term of endearment. Be wary of all kinds of Pied Pipers. There's many of them out there, and occasionally they'll tell you what they are. So any fad, any trend, any movement. I've selected a few at random here. It's not that I'm particularly picking on these scenes. There'll be many that I've left out, which have been just as affected, but I feel these just help to tell the story and reinforce the points in the best way. So we had the new romantic scene. There was punk music in the UK. We'll be taking a closer look at punk in part 2. Mid-70s, going into the late 70s, that paved the way for some different musical styles. New wave, we had two-tone, and we had the explosion of new romantic music in sort of 1980 onwards. And this came with its own dress code and its own fashions and its own venue, its own meeting point, the Blitz Club in Covent Garden, London. Another thing you find with these scenes is often there are locations around which the culture is centred. So the new romantic scene was all about the Blitz Club. We've got Steve Strange here, who headed up that club along with a DJ named Rusty Egan, pictured over on the right. Steve Strange came out of another military family, would you believe, and he ticks all the boxes for having been an MKUltra mind control victim himself. That might have something to do with his naming, Steve Strange. His real name was Steve Harrington. And here we've got a young Midge Ure and various other faces on that scene. And unfortunately, it bears all the hallmarks of having been put in place by social engineers. One of the main groups to have come out of that whole scene was Adam and the Ants. And Adam Ant himself is a character who's much worth studying. Real name, Stuart Goddard. His father was out of the military, he was an army soldier, and he was also named in a paedophile scandal, which emerged some decades ago. Turns out he was part of a paedophile ring, which was affiliated with Jimmy Savile and various others. And Adam Ant himself has had a history of what appears to be mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, that's what we're told. Actually, he ticks all the boxes for having been a victim of trauma-based mind control of the MKUltra variety. There was a very famous incident in 2002 where he threw a car battery through a pub window in London, and he was promptly sectioned under the Mental Health Act and spent a long period away from the scenes. That often is a euphemism for going back into one of these mind control labs to have the programming topped up. So Adam Ant's story has not been a happy one, but there'll be a reason why he was selected to be the front man of this particular band, to be at the forefront of this particular scene, because it suited the controllers at the time for these kinds of ideas to get pushed out there. Many of the pop videos from these new romantic acts feature suspect occult symbolism, much of it coming out of Freemasonry. And then if we fast forward a bit to the 90s, we had another manufactured scene, so-called Cool Britannia. Remember, if it comes with its own tagline and its own catchy name, it will have been devised by social engineers. So the Britpop scene, another dialectic. So earlier in the 80s, schoolgirls were being asked to choose between Duran Duran or Spandau Ballet. Which one do you fancy the most, girls? John Taylor out of Duran Duran or Martin Kemp out of Spandau Ballet? Then in the 90s it was, hey, cool kids, which group do you like the best? Oasis out of the north or Blur out of the south? Doesn't really matter which one you pick, because either way, the same agendas are being pushed. The whole Cool Britannia thing was to a very large extent to get Tony Blair accepted as by young people of the time as cool, down with the kids, ready for that all-important general election on 1st of May 1997, when New Labour would come in and Blair would be at the helm for all the agendas that would follow. The assassination of Princess Diana later that year, 9/11 in 2001, 7/7 in 2005. They had to have their man in place for all of these. So they recruited Noel Gallagher and others like him to reinforce this idea of Tony Blair as not this cross-dressing, psychopathic, satanic, genocidal maniac, but a cool guy, you know, that used to be in some bands, played a bit of guitar, smoked a few spliffs, you know, cool guy. So that's the image of him that was sold, and unfortunately I know many people from that time who fell for it hook, line and sinker. They were literally dancing in the streets when New Labour got into office in '97. A few years down the line, how many millions of people have died as a result of the genocidal agendas put into place by Blair? But that's what this one was all about. It's selling the public an idea, an image, and it's all false. And there's a statement which pretty much sums up the entire dynamic from the late, great George Carlin, and many of you probably already know what it is, but just for the record,
it's a big club, and you ain't in it.
And nor would you want to be. Of illustrating the points that I made in part one. One really good place to start when it comes to the punk scene of both America and Britain is in considering the naming of the genre in the first place. Because names are important, right? They tell us things. So what does punk mean then? Well, Jan Irvin and Joe Atwell got into this on episode 54 of Unspun. Various official definitions include a young man used as a homosexual partner, especially in prison, an aggressive and violent young man, an inexperienced young person, a cowardly or weak young man, an inferior, rotten, worthless person or thing, a petty criminal or hoodlum. So isn't it amazing the amount of people who are running around referring to themselves as punk rockers? I'm a punk. Not the most flattering of terms when you look at the origins of it. The punk scene had as one of its major influential figures one of the original beat poets from an earlier generation, Allen Ginsberg. I would suggest not necessarily anyone's real idea of a true hero. So as well as being a beat poet and a cultural hero of the 50s and the counterculture of the 60s, he was also a founder member of NAMBLA, National Association of, I forget the exact breakdown of it, but it's an organisation that campaigns for men to be able to legally have sex with underage boys. So, nice man. We're seeing some themes starting to emerge here. As I said, certain locations are tied in with certain genres and scenes. And when it comes to the punk scene of New York, we have the Hotel Chelsea, a very sinister place. Many poets, writers, novelists, filmmakers have holed themselves up at the Chelsea at some point or other. In Musical Truth Volume 2, I go through a long list of names who have called the Chelsea home at one point or another. In particular, it was the location where Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen, his girlfriend, lived for a period leading up to Nancy's unfortunate death on the 12th of October, Aleister Crowley's birth date, in 1978, where she's said to have been stabbed to death by an out-of-his-mind Sid Vicious in a heroin-induced haze. I think there's a lot more to that story than meets the eye, as do many other researchers, and this also is explored in volume 2 of my book. But suffice to say, the Chelsea is a deeply unsettling place. Elvis Costello, a hero of the new wave scene out of Ireland/Britain, had a song called I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea, and I'm not bloody surprised. Spearheading the punk scene out of London in the mid-1970s was Malcolm McLaren, a highly eccentric character. Eccentric is a friendly way of putting it, I feel. Here he is with his girlfriend Vivienne Westwood, and no relation to Tim Westwood as far as I know, and they were involved in devising many of the original fashions for the London punk scene, based around this their shop named Sex in Kings Road, Chelsea. So here's Malcolm with his t-shirt with the slogan Cambridge Rapist on it, nice man. He also ran a magazine titled Chicken. Now, for anyone who's studied many of the food-related terms coming in the wake of the Pizzagate allegations of 2016 and beyond, you might be aware that various terms such as pasta, pizza, hot dog, chicken are used by paedophiles to denote the passing around of young children, and chicken is one such phrase. So should we be concerned that Malcolm McLaren once ran a fanzine titled Chicken? He was a fan of, in the words of one of his closest friends, making things worse. He was the manager for a brief time of Adam Ant, as well as the group Bow Wow Wow, and under McLaren's directorship, the front girl of Bow Wow Wow, Annabella Lewin, was pictured naked on one of their sleeve releases when she was 14 years of age. So that's the type of fella McLaren was. He was also a close personal associate of the aforementioned Africa Bambaataa, as well as discovering and putting on the map the Sex Pistols, who spearheaded that brief but highly influential punk era. So the two most prominent members of the Sex Pistols were the aforementioned Sid Vicious, real name John Simon Ritchie. His parents met when they both served in the Royal Air Force. And you can't get much more punk rock than that, right? And his father also worked for a time as a Beefeater guardsman outside Buckingham Palace. Yeah, anti-establishment. So Sid was named after Johnny Rotten's pet hamster, who was called Sid. And one time it bit him, and he said, "Oh, Sid's really vicious." And so his artist name within the Sex Pistols was born, so we're told, if that's not an over-embellished Cinderella fairy story. Then we have Johnny Rotten, real name John Lydon. In his autobiography, Anger is an Energy, he spoke of having attended kinky sex parties at the House of Commons, at which he saw various prominent politicians in compromising positions with call girls and rent boys. But he doesn't adequately explain what he himself was doing there in the first place. Anyway, we'll come back to Johnny Rotten as we progress. Another major band at that punk new wave scene in Britain was The Clash, and the prominent member of that group was Joe Strummer, real name John Graham Mellor. He turns out to be the son of a British diplomat, politician, born in Ankara, Turkey. So we're starting to see a few trends emerging, and it starts to become reminiscent of what we saw in the 60s in America with that whole counterculture scene, where the fathers of all the main musicians who are shaping and changing culture have these direct connections into the world of the military and different aspects of the establishment. The other main member of The Clash, and later Big Audio Dynamite, was Mick Jones. Would you believe he just happens to be a cousin of the former Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps? Grant Shapps is known for having doctored his own Wikipedia page to conceal and cover up certain shady business connections he had. So, a man you can trust, and Mick Jones' cousin. The manager of The Clash was a guy named Bernie Rhodes, and he turns out to have been a situationist. He was into this intellectual, highbrow sort of cultural movement coming out of France, known as situationism. Malcolm McLaren was also a situationist. So we have the managers of the two most prominent punk and new wave bands, both adhering to this same tradition. So I mentioned this in Volume 2. Situationist International is described as an international organisation of social revolutionaries made up of avant-garde artists, intellectuals and political theorists. It also has ties to the Frankfurt School, which we experienced in Part 1. The punk scenes out of London and New York were largely interchangeable. The personnel involved with many of the bands could be applied to either side of the Atlantic, And one of the biggest groups to emerge out of America in those times was Talking Heads. When we get into the members of this group, we find some interesting stuff. So the frontman David Byrne was involved with a couple of religious movements which smack of being mind control cults. Then we have a husband and wife duo over on the left, Chris Frantz and Tina Weymouth. Now, we have some interesting family connections through Tina Weymouth. First coming from her brother Jan, who was a Harvard graduate. He turns out to have been chief of design for the Chinese-American architect I.M. Pai on the Grand Louvre project in Paris, involving the placement of the iconic glass pyramid. The family's Masonic links seem to be represented here. Jan also designed the Salvador Dali Museum at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and was awarded the National Order of Merit from France. Meanwhile, his sisters playing in a punk band. Then we can look at their father, Ralph Weymouth, a Vice Admiral of the US Navy. Is it just me, or is there another pattern emerging here? And a Master of the Freemasonic Grand Lodge of Maine. Their great-grandfather was Anatole Labraz, known as the Bard of Brittany, a highly regarded folklore poet and lecturer at Harvard and Yale universities. Anatole married Mabel Davidson, the sister to Henry Pomeroy Davison, which brings a link to Yale, Skull and Bones. Henry was a senior partner of the banking monolith J.P. Morgan, worked with the Astor Place Bank, and was instrumental in the creation of the Federal Reserve System, attending the notorious 1910 meeting at Jekyll Island. But Wikipedia describes him merely as a philanthropist. And it's because of this that I'm definitely one day going to put together a presentation titled "No One's Dad's a Plumber," because that is an accurate statement. Love telling this story. There was one family which had a chokehold over the punk and new wave scene in both Britain and America in the 1970s, going forward into the 80s, and this was the Copeland family. The patriarch of this particular family was Miles Axe Copeland, and he was a big-time career CIA operative, a legend in intelligence circles. He had 3 sons who he put to use in the music industry. All of them had influential roles. So from the left we have Ian Copeland, now deceased. In the middle you might recognise Stuart Copeland, the drummer with the group The Police. And then on the right is Miles Copeland Jr. So they had record labels, they had artist management companies, they had booking agencies, they had a show on MTV where they would only showcase artists signed to their own labels. And they used to like to give a few sly nods as to their true nature as a family. So they had a holding company for their various operations, which they called Copeland International Artists, or CIA. They also had an artist booking company, which was known as Frontier Booking International, and they had a record label called International Records Syndicate. There was also their house band, The Police, as in they were there to police the other groups on the scene and make sure that only approved ones got through to any measure of success, featuring Sting, as in a sting operation. It takes you by surprise and you never see it coming. Two of the members of the Detroit 1960s proto-punk group MC5, Motor City 5, Wayne Kramer and Michael Davis, were inmates at the Federal Medicine Center in Lexington, Kentucky, known initially as the United States Narcotic Farm. It turns out to be one of the key hospitals involved in the CIA's MKUltra drug experimentation program. And another hero of the beat poet scene, William Burroughs, attended the very same institution. Connections for days. There are even connections in the punk scene into the world of serial killers. So Debbie Harry of Blondie, real name Angela Trimble, she was from a Scottish family, but she was adopted by a guy named Harry, hence her adopted name. She claims that the serial killer Ted Bundy once tried to abduct her before she became famous. She got into a car with him, she says, and then she noticed that there were no handles on the inside of the car, but somehow she managed to escape. That's the story she tells. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a true story, but it does mean that a famous figure from the punk scene is being used to reinforce the official story of a serial killer. And there are other examples of this phenomenon as well. I detail many of them in my book. Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders, here's an interesting story, because she claims that in 1970, she was a student at the university that was involved in the Kent State shootings, the Kent State massacres, so called, when the National Guard shot 67 bullets at college students, injuring 9 and killing 4, part of the student revolutions that were all the rage at the time. There was also a member of the group Devo who claims he was present at the Kent State massacre as well. So we must ask ourselves, what are the chances of someone who would go on to become very famous in a group like Pretenders and being paired off with Jim Kerr of Simple Minds being at this event at this time? You could write one event off as just one of those things and, against the odds, just one of those crazy coincidences, but it keeps happening. We keep getting told that famous people were either at the scene or narrowly missed being at the scene of various very influential events. So the Lockerbie jet bombing of 1988, which took place on the 21st of December, the winter solstice, there are various celebrities who claim they narrowly missed being on board that plane. They include Johnny Rotten, who states that he and his wife were due to be on that flight, but she spent so long packing that they missed their ride to the airport, missed the flight, and had to rebook themselves onto another one. The Four Tops, the entire group, were in the Top of the Pops studio in London, recording a performance and then due to fly back, but they were late, so they missed the flight, so we're told. And the actress Kim Cattrall from Sex and the City says that she was in Harrods in London trying to find a gift for her mother to take back to America, and she spent so long at shopping that she too missed her flight. Phew, lucky escape for all of them. What are the chances of those stories actually being true and all those people really being booked on that flight? We must ask ourselves, and of all of them being late. Because if they hadn't been late and they'd all have been on time, the headlines on that day would have been very different. I think these popular culture scenes are used to push other agendas. I think a lot of it amounts to a cult mockery of what they perceive to be the profanity of the masses. And in many cases, it can amount to a cult initiation rituals. So the Rolling Stones had a concert in December of 1969 at the Altamont racetrack in California. It resulted in disaster when 4 people lost their lives. One young lad was stabbed up by Hell's Angels right in front of the stage while the group was performing. And that event was caught on film by a budding young filmmaker who nobody had heard of at the time, but we have now. His name was George Lucas. What are the chances of him just happening to be there when this event went off? It just smacks of his initiation into the higher levels of the industry through this event, and I think we see a lot of it. So the likes of Tavistock and all these other institutions are responsible for devising agendas and even phrases such as this. So they employ behavioural psychiatrists, behavioural scientists and anthropologists to come up with the most effective way of delivering messaging. And they've realised that when you get a 3-pronged phrase like this, it's far more likely to embed itself into the public's consciousness. So that's why during the COVID debacle, we heard endlessly phrases like, stay alert, control the virus, save lives. There's Johnson doing the same thing, but this is probably what it should have said, in my opinion. Something else that was happening at the time was a phenomenon which has come to be known as mass formation psychosis. And there's a professor by the name of Matthias Desmet who has commented quite a lot on how this works in recent times. Here's an interview snippet from a film with Mickey Willis in which he goes further into how this technique gets utilised and how it explains some of the plain bizarre behaviours that so many people have undertaken in recent years, which prior to 2020 would have seemed impossible, and yet most fell for it.
I have 2 master degrees, one in clinical psychology and one in statistics. And in the beginning of the crisis, I started to study the statistics a little bit, and I immediately had the impression that the initial mathematical models and the initial statistics all had indeed dramatically overrated the dangerousness of the virus. That was the moment when I started to think how it was possible that an entire society and an entire population was in the grip of a narrative which in many respects was blatantly wrong or absurd. After a few months it became clear to me that the only mechanism that could explain what was happening in society was what is usually referred to as mass formation.
I wear a mask when I'm outside all the time. I even run with a mask on. And also because I want to make it be a symbol for people to see that that's the kind of thing you should be doing.
Sweden's with 0 new COVID cases, despite the country dropping the mandatory wearing of masks.
The process of mass formation is identical to hypnosis. An individual that is in the grip of a process of mass formation typically becomes radically blind for everything that goes against the narratives where the masses or the group believes in. They seem to have lost all interest in the things that were important to them before the mass formation started, which make them radically willing to self-sacrifice, to sacrifice themselves for the collective.
Obviously, you don't like to tell people what to do, but sometimes for the good of society, that's necessary.
They become radically intolerant for dissonant voices. And this typically goes further and further and further. People who do not go along with the masses are stigmatized, and in the end, the masses typically are inclined to destroy the people who do not go along with them. And they do so as if it is an ethical duty to do so.
So that all goes a very long way to explaining what we've all lived through these past 4 crazy years, doesn't it? So if pop stars just kind of work their way up the ladder of success by themselves without any outside help, and it's just up to random chance who becomes famous, why do we see people like will.i.am, or as I call him, shill.i.am, appearing at Davos meetings with the World Economic Forum and things like this, you know, hanging out there at their seminars? And he's been named as an ambassador for AI to the WEF. What could possibly go wrong? Mind controlled to oblivion in my book, and the music, if you can call it music, that he's been pushing through the Black Eyed Peas and through his solo stuff is glorifying transhumanism and AI electronic ways of doing things. These are extracurricular activities. So you have people who are made famous, they're allowed to become prominent as musicians or actors, whatever it may be. And then when they start adhering to certain globalist agendas and start pushing certain ideas, they're far more likely to be accepted by the general public because they've decided that they trust and like this individual. There's Leonardo DiCaprio hanging out next to Klaus Schwab and all of them in Davos, all pals together. Speaking of which, wheel out the sirs. For COVID, we had an assortment of different sirs. Sir Elton John doing his bit with his ad. I'll spare you that one. He was on that same ad with another sir, This one from the acting world, Sir Michael Caine. You don't get to enjoy a career as long-lasting and prolific as this guy's without being part of the club. And when that phone rings and you're ordered or invited to nail your colours to a particular mast, you don't get to say no. This one was particularly sickening for me. Lenny Henry, who I used to like back in the Tis Was days, that's how far I go back. So there's another one gone. This ad was targeted at the black community during the middle of COVID because they'd noticed that there was a significantly lower uptake of the vaccines among black and Asian communities. Why could that be, I wonder? A mistrust of establishment authority on the part of these communities? Surely not. So they wheeled out a ragtag bunch of black celebrities to try and appeal to that demographic. And this is just sickening, so let's have a look at it.
Don't let their sacrifice be in vain. Don't let your concerns be the thing that widens racial inequality in our society. Don't let coronavirus cost even more black lives. Because we matter.
Traitors, everyone. There he is, equating that agenda with another one, Black Lives Matter. Notice they get that sly little reference in, so 2 for the price of 1. And these are absolute sellouts, sold their people, their communities down the river for a quick buck, or because they're beholden to the overlords that gave them their careers in the first place. Just sickening, just shameful. There was another one done for the Asian community, featuring actors from Goodness Gracious Me and various others. A lifetime actor's work is never done, particularly when you're a Sir. Paul McCartney, or whoever it may be, if that's even him. I mean, if that's even the imposter. Could be anyone in a bloody beanie and a mask. And, we don't see the needle going in there. So anything could be happening, but the caption is, be cool, get vaxxed, because cool people get vaxxed, don't you know? Mick Jagger will tell you the same, Sir Mick. In 2021, hits out anti-vaxxers. You can't argue with these people. Well, you can't when you're a lifetime actor. And you can't when you just happen to crop up in Jeffrey Epstein's Little Black Book. This is a story from months back about 301 Britons, including Mick Jagger, Tony Blair, can't be true, surely, and Richard Branson. Sorry, Sir Richard Branson. And how many more names have come forward since? A lifetime actor's work is never done. Neil Young will tell you that. Joni Mitchell will tell you that. So these two were heroes of the counterculture scene of the 1960s. Decades later, when COVID hits, Neil Young gets his knickers in a twist over Spotify allowing a podcast by Joe Rogan on their platform featuring Dr. Robert Malone questioning the efficacy, the safety of the COVID vaccines. Neil Young says that he's going to pull all his music from Spotify, including Keep On Rocking in the Free World, if Spotify don't do what he wants and remove this podcast. And then Joni Mitchell comes forward in solidarity to her old friend Neil and says she's going to do the same. So 50 odd years after they first emerged, they're still being used to push agendas. Somebody once emailed into me with this statement. My ideas are that they have musical styles and associated cultures ready to reel out at different periods to fit in with the technology, drugs, and social attitudes of the time. Psychedelic music for the 60s, rock and punk for the 70s, house music for the 80s, drum and bass for the 90s, etc. I would say that's absolutely bang on. The sad cat meme. That face you make when you realise all the personal heroes you used to look up to were just lifetime actors on the payroll all along. There's wisdom to be gleaned from the words of the song Won't Get Fooled Again by The Who, not Ted Ross's lot, Roger Daltrey's lot. So in this song, they've got the lyrics, there's nothing in the street looks any different to me, and the slogans are effaced by the by. And the parting on the left is now the parting on the right, and the beards have all grown longer overnight. That song is about the science of social engineering, and they're making the statement that we won't get fooled again. That has to be a mantra for the rest of us. We have to learn the methods and the techniques that are used and resolve to never be fooled in the same way again. There's an origin to the phrase, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Because we're supposed to learn from these experiences and not let it happen again. There's also wisdom to be gleaned simply in the title of one of the prominent new wave bands, the Stranglers, who had a song called No More Heroes. And I would add to that, at all, ever. Thanks for listening.